Hello, and welcome to a discussion of trigger weapon options for use with Arcanist Brand Triggerbots setups in Path of Exile. I am Surgeon General, and in this video I will be going over the 3 archetypes of trigger weapons that can be used in builds which leverage Arcanist Brand and Triggerbots to rapidly generate many spell activations with as few button presses as possible. The footage playing in the background is Tier 16 mapping content from my Eye of Winter Triggerbot Assassin, which shows one example of how Brand Recall can be used with chain triggering to create spell casting loops similar to methods like Cast on Crit or Ward Loop. The chain triggering mechanic hinges on using weapons with the Veiled modifier, trigger a socketed spell on using a skill. These weapons are known as trigger weapons. These mods can be found on all weapon types, but the archetype you use will lead to 3 broad outcomes. First, wands paired with a shield will be the best all-around option, giving access to defensive options such as life, spell suppression, resists, and increased maximum resistances. Second, specific staffs can be crafted which allow the player to scale their damage in 2 different dimensions, by directly increasing the damage of their main skill, and indirectly by increasing the cooldown recovery rate of Brand Recall. Finally, the third option is to dual wield wands. This setup allows the player to set up 2 independent Brand Recall instances which do not share a cooldown, enabling spell output and therefore damage to be increased by up to 50%. As chain triggering is a relatively new and unknown mechanic, I will start with a brief explanation of its use. For a more thorough explanation, please see my recent build guide, which goes into the mechanic in depth. Chain triggering relies on the use of skitterbots, which doubles the activation of all triggered spells, bypassing cooldowns. One way to force triggers is by linking a damage spell to Arcanist Brand. When Arcanist Brand activates, it triggers linked spells. Any spell can be used, but I will be using Eye of Winter in my examples because of its synergies with Arcanist Brand. Since the Arcanist Brand activations are triggers, our skitterbots double each activation. Furthermore, Brand Recall can be cast to force activations of all our brands. By stacking up to 7 maximum brands on the passive tree and getting 2 spell generations per brand, we can auto-cast 14 spells per Brand Recall use. This process can be taken one step further by adding in the second trigger in our chain. Since Brand Recall is itself a spell, we can socket it in a weapon with the modifier trigger a socketed spell on using a skill. Our skitterbots will therefore double the use of Brand Recall, adding another multiplier of 2 into the chain. Our chain of triggers therefore looks like the following. When we use any skill, Brand Recall triggers twice. Each of those recalls activates 7 Arcanist brands, which each generates 2 spell uses. The result is that provided we have our maximum number of brands out, we generate 28 spells anytime we use a skill. In practice, all we need to do is run around a map while casting Arcanist Brand to refresh their duration. Each time we do so, we spit out 28 instances of our damaging ability. Builds using chain triggering have an additional method to scale their damage per second. Alongside traditional methods of scaling hit damage from spells, such as gem levels and increased spell damage modifiers, these builds can also scale the cooldown recovery rate of Brand Recall. By lowering the cooldown of Brand Recall, you increase the number of casts of your main spell that are generated per unit time, and therefore increase your DPS. The Brand Recall cooldown is affected by generic cooldown recovery rate modifiers, such as those found on boot and belt explicits, but is available in much larger quantities in modifiers that are for Brand Recall specifically, like is available on the Brand Mastery and from other passives on the tree. Additionally, the Brand Recall gem offers methods for scaling its cooldown. Each gem level provides an additional 8% cooldown recovery rate, and the alternate anomalous gem gives 1% CDR per 1% quality. This allows the use of the exceptional support gems Empower and Enhance for scaling damage. Each level of Empower or Enhance beyond the first adds an additional 8% cooldown recovery rate to Brand Recall. Finally, remember that Brand Recall is itself a skill, and so it is affected by non-local modifiers to skill gems, such as Ashes of the Stars. By itself, this amulet grants up to 38% CDR to brand recall, in addition to the benefits it adds to the build's main damaging ability. The following trigger weapon setups will leverage these scaling methods in different combinations. The first option for trigger weapons and offhands is the Wand and Shield setup. This archetype is an all-around solution for jack-of-all-trade characters. Mods on the one-handed weapon will simply scale the damage of the main skill through traditional methods. A shield will be used in the offhand to provide access to defensive stats such as life, spell suppression, and resistances. If your goal is to create a character that can complete all content, this is likely your best option. In this setup, brand recall will be scaled with socketed support gems only. No explicit mods will be used. There will be socket room for one exceptional gem to increase the brand recall cooldown recovery rate, and the gem sockets in the offhand can be used for utility setups, such as a Divine Blessing aura. The second option for trigger weapons is crafting a staff specifically targeted at simultaneously scaling the damage of the main skill as well as the cooldown of brand recall. Since brand recall is also a spell, a +2 to the level of all spell skill gems mod is very useful, as it provides an approximately 20% damage increase to the main damage skill, as well as 16% cooldown recovery for brand recall. Since this option provides a 6-link instead of 2 3-links, it also allows for the reduction of socket pressure by sharing supports among different skills. Moving the Divine Blessing that was socketed in the shield from the previous example into the 6-link staff makes it so that the Inspiration support gem is shared between both Divine Blessing and Brand Recall, saving one socket from the previous setup. This allows us to add Empower to the Brand Recall links for additional cooldown recovery. Note that this only works because Divine Blessing skills cannot be triggered, and therefore it does not interfere with the brand recall trigger loop that is occurring from the weapon. With the additional mod space on the weapon, one can choose to further increase the damage of the main skill directly with the use of plus levels to elemental spell skill gems, or one can craft plus levels to support gems in order to further reduce the cooldown of brand recall because of the scaling from Empower and Enhance. In general, the bottom of these two options will be more effective in terms of overall DPS because of the diminishing returns on cooldown recovery rate. This two-handed staff option provides superior damage compared to the Wand and Shield setup shown previously. As a trade-off, you lose access to defensive mods. The final option for trigger weapon setups is the dual-wielding wands, which enables a mechanic for double brand recalls. To do so, you will use one weapon with the Unveiled trigger mod, which has a 4-second cooldown, and a second weapon with the crafted version of the same mod. You will socket a copy of Brand Recall with whatever supports you choose in both weapons. The base 4-second cooldown of Brand Recall in the second weapon is overwritten by the 8-second cooldown from the crafted mod. Since the two Brand Recalls have different base cooldowns, the two instances of Brand Recall are independent, and you are then granted two different Brand Recalls on your skill bar. The cooldowns of these two skills do not queue, they recover independently. What this means is that every other cooldown period, two Brand Recall activations will occur instead of one. With chain triggering and skitterbots, this will lead to a spell generation sequence of 28 spells, a cooldown period followed by 56 spells, and then the sequence will repeat. This is effectively a 50% increase in the number of spells being generated. While this is obviously very powerful, you've had to give up the defensive options that a shield provides in order to have a second source of triggering. On top of this, this mechanic produces noticeable slowdowns even in Hideout. For my PC build, frame time is about 25% higher at the point that the double triggers occur. While possibly useful for dedicated bossing characters, using this mechanic in mapping content would likely be unplayable for those without very high-end PCs. My personal recommendation for a trigger weapon setup is the Wand and Shield. This enables the building of well-rounded characters that can complete most content in a game. DPS scaling is done in traditional manners by directly scaling the damage of the main skill rather than brand recall. However, this results in the lowest DPS of the three options. The staff method instead provides two damage scaling vectors, via the spell skill and via brand recall. Additionally, by taking advantage of synergies between support gems, you can reduce the number of copies of expensive gems such as Divergent Inspiration that are needed. The drawback of this archetype is the loss of defensive mods from the shield. Finally, I showed a method for achieving 50% increased damage by doubling brand recall instances with dual wands. While this is the highest damage option by quite a margin, it leads to poor game performance. Additionally, the duplication of gems in both weapons reduces the total number of sockets available for support skills such as auras, curses, and movement skills. In my iteration of the Eye of Winter build, this socket pressure meant that there was not space for a Divine Blessing aura setup. I hope this video has given you some ideas for how to set up chain triggers in your builds. If you are interested in a build guide which takes advantage of these mechanics, I have linked my Eye of Winter Triggerbot Assassin in the description below. If you have enjoyed the video or are interested in more content of this type, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.